They did not fire me after 12 years. They did something worse. Our CEO smiled, telling me to show team spirit, right after he took my 8-month project and handed it to a 24-year-old intern. He assumed I would swallow the humiliation and quietly clear her path to the spotlight. He had no idea that the company's fragile survival was built entirely on my hidden framework, and it was about to walk out the door with me. My name is Emory Ramirez. I am 41 years old, and for the last 12 years, I have been the invisible spine of Briargate Commerce Systems in Charlotte, North Carolina. My official title is Senior Operating Architect for Fulfillment and Reverse Logistics in the corporate world. That means I am the person who cleans up the massive operational messes nobody else wants to touch. When millions of dollars of physical inventory get tangled in transit, or when customers flood the system with returns and the data mapping threatens to collapse, I am the one who builds the ironclad framework to keep the company from bleeding out. It is grueling, highly technical work. It is also completely devoid of glamour, meant to be effective rather than seen. It was a Thursday morning when the architecture of my entire professional life was casually stolen and handed to a stranger. I walked into the main conference room for the scheduled all-hands meeting and immediately saw the catered breakfast spread. Freshly baked artisan croissants, expensive fruit platters, and premium coffee carafes lined the back wall. At Briargate, free food was never a gesture of appreciation. It was a glaring, flashing warning sign. Whenever our chief executive officer, Owen Mercer, authorized the good breakfast, it meant he was about to announce a decision he knew the entire operational floor was going to despise. He was attempting to buy our silent compliance with expensive carbohydrates. Owen strode into the room a few minutes late, his tailored suit projecting the kind of hollow, unearned confidence that venture capitalists always seem to trust blindly. Walking half a step behind him was Ivy Sloan. Ivy was 24 years old. She had been with the company for less than 1 month, holding the vague, newly invented title of Strategy Intern. She was also, in a detail that explained absolutely everything, the goddaughter of a major private equity investor who had thrown Briargate a massive financial lifeline during our last, desperate funding round. Ivy had bright eyes, perfect posture, a very expensive business degree, and absolutely zero understanding of how a supply chain actually functioned in the real world. The room quieted down. The lights dimmed, and the massive projector screen at the front of the room flickered to life. The bold title slide read, Project Holloway. My stomach turned to pure ice, but my posture remained perfectly relaxed. I did not blink. Project Holloway was my creation. For 8 agonizing months, I had stayed at the office long after the sun went down, mapping out the complicated architecture. It was a comprehensive, deeply complex system designed to synchronize return inventory, block refund fraud at the gateway level, and optimize our entire warehouse network just in time for the brutal holiday season. I had built every single logic tree. I had untangled every legacy code disaster left by previous engineers. I had personally negotiated the operational blueprints with our carrier partners. Holloway was the absolute crown jewel of my 12 years of service. Owen took the center of the room, flashing his signature, heavily rehearsed executive smile. Team, as we look toward the future of Briargate, we must pivot toward a more dynamic market presence, Owen began, his voice dripping with empty corporate buzzwords. We must embrace innovation at every level. As we transition into the upcoming holiday rush, we need fresh perspectives. We need young energy and next-gen thinking to lead our most critical initiatives. He turned and extended a hand toward Ivy. She stepped forward, offering a modest, carefully practiced smile to the crowd. That is why I am incredibly thrilled to announce that Ivy Sloan will be stepping up as the new leadership face and primary project owner of Project Holloway, Owen declared, his voice booming off the glass walls of the conference room. Ivy has demonstrated incredible strategic vision in her short time here, and she is perfectly positioned to take this vital platform across the finish line and present it to our investors. He clicked the remote to the next slide. It displayed the new organizational chart for the rollout. Ivy sat at the very top in a brightly colored box. Below her were various department heads and implementation teams. My name was entirely absent from the screen. It had not been moved to an advisory role. It had not been demoted to a secondary tier. It had been completely erased. Owen was taking 8 months of my grueling, highly technical labor, stripping my identity from the official documentation, and handing the entire package to a 24-year-old who did not know the difference between a merchant chargeback and a carrier routing exception. The silence that crashed down over the room was absolute. It was not the silence of a team in awe. It was the suffocating, terrified silence of 60 professionals witnessing a daylight robbery and praying the thief did not look in their direction. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a second pastry. Most importantly, nobody dared to look at me. Every single engineer, every project manager, and every operations lead in that room knew exactly who had built Project Holloway. They had sat in the trenches with me. They had relied on my expertise to solve problems they could not comprehend. Now, they all suddenly found the grain of the wooden conference table utterly fascinating. They were holding their breath, waiting for a reaction. They expected me to flush bright red, to slam my hands on the table, or to storm out of the room in tears of frustration. I did absolutely none of those things. I let the silence stretch out, heavy and unbearable, allowing Owen to stand up there and feel the distinct, humiliating lack of applause. Then, raising my hands, I began to clap. I clapped slowly, deliberately, the rhythmic sound echoing sharply against the quiet walls. It was polite enough that human resources could never accuse me of causing a disruption, but cold enough, sharp enough, that anyone with half a brain understood the message. Something fundamental had just snapped in half. I was not clapping to congratulate Ivy. I was clapping for the sheer, unadulterated audacity of a chief executive sealing his own doom in front of the entire company. A few uncomfortable, scattered claps joined mine, mostly from the junior sales team who were oblivious to the underlying technical theft. Owen hurriedly pushed through the rest of the presentation, his smile pulling a fraction tighter. The energy in the room utterly dead. When the meeting finally concluded, the room emptied faster than a building with a pulled fire alarm. People scurried back to their desks, eager to distance themselves from the blast radius. I gathered my leather notebook, stood up, and walked back to my workstation. My steps were measured, my breathing perfectly calm. I had barely sat down at my desk when the sharp scent of expensive cologne announced Owen's arrival. He leaned casually against the low partition of my cubicle, trying to project a friendly, collaborative demeanor. He looked down at me with the patronizing expression of a man who firmly believed he held all the leverage. "Great energy in there today, Emory," Owen said smoothly, his voice pitched low so the neighboring engineers could not overhear. "Listen, I know Holloway was your baby in the early developmental stages. You did solid groundwork. But we have to play the politics with the investors right now. You understand how these high-level optics work." I looked up at him, keeping my expression completely blank. I let him fill the uncomfortable void. "I expect you to support Ivy closely during the transition phase," he continued, phrasing it as a gentle request, but delivering it with the hard edge of a command. "Show her the ropes. Make sure the technical handover is completely seamless before the investor preview. I really want you to demonstrate your team's spirit here. Emory, being a mentor will reflect very well on your year-end performance review." He was standing in my workspace, asking me to train my usurper. He truly believed I would swallow the bitter humiliation. Stay quietly in my lane, clear the complex technical path for the investor's goddaughter, and watch her take a triumphant bow on a stage built entirely from my own sweat. He thought I was safely trapped by my 12 years of corporate loyalty, tethered to my desk by a comfortable salary and the paralyzing fear of starting over at 41 years old. "I understand perfectly, Owen," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotional inflection whatsoever. "I will handle the transition exactly as it needs to be handled." He smiled, a wide, visibly relieved expression. He clearly believed he had just managed a difficult personality with expert executive leadership. That is exactly what I like to hear. Emory, you are a team player, through and through. He patted the top of my cubicle wall twice and walked away, his polished leather shoes clicking confidently against the carpet. He had no idea what he had just done. He did not know that for the past 12 years, the only thing keeping Briargate standing was not his inspirational all-hands speeches, his golf course handshakes, or his desperate venture capital pitches. It was my operational memory. It was the intricate framework of unwritten rules, the customized code exceptions, and the deep, hard-earned trust of our biggest enterprise clients. And all of it was currently preparing to walk right out the front door. I turned back to my monitors. I did not open my email client to draft a bitter complaint to human resources. I did not message my work friends to vent my anger. I simply reached down to the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one I intentionally kept locked. I turned the small brass key, pulled the heavy drawer open, and lifted out a thick, unmarked manila folder. I had started compiling the documents inside that folder many months ago, back when Owen first began systematically pushing me out of high-level strategy meetings. It was a comprehensive contingency plan, a meticulously organized collection of legal boundaries, contract clauses, and transition protocols that I had legally secured. In my mind, I had always referred to this specific folder as the nuclear option. It was the file reserved strictly for the day I realized they actually dared to cross the final line. They had just crossed it. I placed the heavy folder squarely in the center of my desk, resting my hands flat against the cool surface of the paper. The cold knot of anger in my stomach slowly uncoiled, replaced by a crystalline, razor-sharp focus. I was not going to throw a tantrum. I was not going to beg for the credit I rightfully deserved. I was simply going to stop being the invisible, load-bearing spine holding up their fragile world. The countdown had officially begun, and the final, fatal blow would not land on the quiet day I handed in my resignation. It would detonate exactly when Briargate needed to look the strongest. When I first walked through the frosted glass doors of Briargate exactly 12 years ago, the reverse logistics department was not a functional business unit. It was an active disaster zone. The company's entire return system was nothing more than a chaotic, tangled web of forwarded emails, bloated spreadsheet files that routinely crashed upon opening, and desperate verbal promises made between exhausted warehouse managers. If a consumer sent back a defective appliance or a misrouted piece of luxury furniture, the tracking data essentially vanished into a terrifying operational black hole. Millions of dollars in physical inventory sat rotting in temporary holding zones across the country. Customer service representatives were blindly issuing full refunds just to avoid dealing with screaming clients on the phone, bleeding the company dry one transaction at a time. Nobody knew where the products were, what condition they were in, or how to get them back onto the active sales floor. I did not just organize that mess, I completely eradicated it. I built a comprehensive, interlocking operational machine from the ground up, writing the foundational rules of engagement when the company had none. I personally mapped out every single conceivable error code and tracking anomaly. I slashed our corporate chargeback rates from a terrifying double-digit hemorrhage to mere fractions of a single %. I shortened the physical restocking time from 3 agonizing weeks to less than 48 hours, single-handedly rescuing the profit margins for our largest, most demanding enterprise clients. It was brutal, highly technical, and completely unglamorous work. It was the kind of grueling labor that happens exclusively in windowless server rooms, surrounded by whiteboards covered in architectural diagrams, or standing on freezing distribution center floors at 2 o'clock in the morning. But the system I constructed became the silent, indestructible engine driving the entire company forward. The most crucial beneficiary of my intricate architecture was Marston Home & Style. They were not just another account on a sales dashboard. They were a massive regional retail chain that consistently brought in nearly 18% of Briargate's total annual revenue. Keeping the executives at Marston happy and their supply chain flowing was the only reason our executive team slept at night. I knew Marston's internal routing logic better than their own highly paid internal auditors did. Whenever their systems threatened to buckle under the weight of seasonal volume, I was the one who quietly reinforced the load-bearing pillars of their data integration. I was also the single point of contact who spent countless grueling hours directly negotiating the critical technical bridges with our most vital external vendors. I sat across the table from the aggressive lead developers at Crescent Scanware for weeks, fighting line by line to custom build the integration layer for our physical warehouse scanning devices. I went to war with the network engineers at Blue Lattice Carrier Network to establish the massive, secure data flow that tracked every single package in real time. I forced them to adopt my error handling protocols because theirs were structurally weak. Those vendor integrations were the absolute lifeblood of the new system. They were the complex, non-negotiable links that made everything function. Without my specific translation layers, Crescent and Blue Lattice could not speak to our internal servers. Corporate loyalty is a dangerous myth sold to the naive, and I have never been a naive professional. 12 years ago, when Briargate was still a scrambling, chaotic startup desperate for a senior architect who could stop their catastrophic financial bleeding, I held all the leverage. During my initial hiring negotiations, I quietly embedded a very specific, highly unconventional intellectual property clause deep within the dense boilerplate text of my standard employment contract. It explicitly stated that any operational process frameworks, custom logic mapping, and proprietary exception libraries I personally developed would remain my exclusive intellectual property. Unless the corporate board of directors passed a formal, written resolution of transfer prior to my departure from the company, it was a dense, highly technical legal trap that the frantic founders signed without a second glance. They only cared about stopping the bleeding today. They never bothered to read the fine print of the bandage that would bind them tomorrow. Years later, when I drafted the massive multi-million-dollar service-level agreement for Marston Home and Style, I wove another invisible failsafe into the fabric of the partnership. I forced a strict, heavily worded continuity clause into the final document. The clause explicitly stated that my specific role as the lead operating architect could not be arbitrarily reassigned via an internal corporate memo, a casual email, or a sudden management whim. Any change in senior operational leadership required a formal written approval process, complete with signatures from both the legal department and the compliance team at Marston. I legally bolted my own technical presence to their massive revenue stream. If Briargate wanted to move me, they had to ask the client for permission first. I did not lay these intricate legal landmines out of innate paranoia or a petty desire for control. I laid them because I possessed the trained ability to observe shifting behavioral patterns. Over the past 3 years, I watched Owen Mercer undergo a very specific, highly toxic executive metamorphosis. As the pressure from our private equity backers intensified, Owen developed a dangerous habit of shoving the veteran employees who actually did the heavy lifting into the shadows. He became entirely obsessed with optics over substance. He started elevating empty suits, placing polished, photogenic faces in front of the board, while the real engineers were locked in the basement keeping the servers from catching fire. I watched him systematically sideline 3 senior developers simply because they did not use the right aggressive buzzwords during client dinners. The exception libraries I built were particularly vital to this dynamic. In logistics, the standard operational path is incredibly easy to manage. The easy path is when a customer returns a shirt, puts the correct label on the pristine box, and the warehouse scans it perfectly. Any inexperienced intern can manage the easy path. The exception libraries handled the operational chaos. What happens when a customer puts a Marston shipping label on a box containing a heavy brick? What happens when a warehouse scanning device loses its wireless connection exactly halfway through processing a $2,000 refund to a furious consumer? My libraries contained thousands of lines of deeply customized logic that caught those disastrous anomalies before they hit the financial ledgers. Those libraries existed solely in my head and in the encrypted framework I legally owned. Briargate was completely blind to the fact that they were driving a high-speed train on tracks they did not actually possess. The final, undeniable warning shot came several months ago, when I was abruptly excluded from 2 consecutive high-level strategy meetings regarding the upcoming holiday rollout. I was the person holding the deepest, most critical operational data in the entire company. Yet my calendar invitations were mysteriously canceled without explanation. I did not ask for a meeting to discuss my feelings. I did not march into the Human Resources Department to lodge a desperate complaint about feeling undervalued. Instead, I quietly opened a blank digital document. I began systematically printing critical vendor agreements, archiving my custom logic pathways, and legally securing the documentation of my proprietary exception libraries. I gathered the absolute proof of my indispensability piece by piece. I prepared for the exact moment they would try to erase my name from my own masterpiece. The thick manila folder sitting on my desk right now is not the product of a sudden, emotional outburst. It is not a panicked reaction to a humiliating morning meeting or a desperate plea for corporate attention. It is the cold, calculated culmination of many months of silent observation, meticulous legal preparation, and absolute patience. I had watched them construct an entire corporate empire on my shoulders, treating my flawless foundation as a guaranteed, permanent right. They took my competence for granted. They forgot a very simple law of structural engineering. The foundation is the only part of the building that can choose to collapse the entire house. 2 days after the brutal all-hands meeting, Ivy Sloan appeared at the edge of my cubicle. She was clutching a thick stack of printed paper, the edges slightly crumpled from her tight grip. I recognized the document immediately. It was the Master Service Level Agreement for Marston Home and Style. "Hey, Emory," Ivy said, her voice carrying that breezy, collegiate casualness that had not yet been beaten out of her by a real crisis. "Do you have a second?" "I was reviewing the vendor integration timelines for the upcoming investor preview next week." "I have a second," I replied evenly, not taking my hands off my keyboard. She dropped the heavy packet onto my desk and pointed to page 42 with a neatly manicured fingernail. "I was looking at this section here, the continuity confirmation steps. I need to spin up the live demonstration environment by Friday, and waiting for their legal team to sign off on a leadership transfer is going to bottleneck the whole schedule. These steps are basically just a formality, right? Like a legacy compliance check we can bypass for the showcase." I looked down at the page. My eyes did not focus on the printed text, but on the frantic, neon pink ink scribbled in the margins. Ivy had been taking notes. Next to the clause dictating mandatory data encryption handoffs, she had written a question mark. Next to the failover routing protocol, she had drawn a circle with a line through it, accompanied by the word skip. A cold chill washed over me. It was one thing for Owen to give her the title. It was an entirely different, catastrophic thing to realize she was actually trying to operate the machine. Ivy did not just lack a fundamental understanding of the project architecture. She was actively trying to rip out load-bearing safety mechanisms because she thought they were annoying speed bumps on her way to a flashy presentation. She was treating a multi-million-dollar live ecosystem like a college group project. "The continuity clause is not a suggestion, Ivy," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat, completely devoid of the panic I felt for the system. "It is a legally binding requirement. Marston requires written verification that the architect overseeing their data flow is qualified and authorized. You cannot bypass it for a live demonstration." Ivy sighed, an exasperated, childish sound. "Well, that is just bad agile methodology. Owen said we need to move fast and break things. I will just have him send a quick email to their vice president to override it." She snatched the contract off my desk and walked away before I could respond. I watched her go, realizing exactly how fast the ship was going to sink. That afternoon, my desk phone chimed. It was Owen, requesting my presence in his corner office. I walked in and sat down in the leather chair opposite his massive mahogany desk. He was leaning back, his hands steepled together, wearing an expression of deep, manufactured empathy. "Emory, I wanted to check in," Owen began, his voice lowered to a confidential murmur. "I know the transition with Project Holloway might feel a bit abrupt, but I need you to be mature about this. Ivy is bright, but she needs guidance. Sometimes, the most valuable role a seasoned veteran can play is to quietly pave the way for the new generation. He was asking me to dig my own professional grave and then hand the shovel to the intern so she could pose for a picture with it. I sat perfectly still. I did not argue. I did not defend my legacy. I simply nodded, letting him believe his pathetic attempt at executive manipulation was working. What Owen did not know was that before I even walked into his office that afternoon, I had spent my lunch hour on a secure phone call with my personal corporate attorney. Together, we had finalized the incorporation documents, secured the tax identification numbers, and officially registered my independent consulting firm. The paperwork was already filed. I was no longer a disgruntled employee. I was a fully operational business entity biding my time. "I understand my role, Owen," I said quietly. He smiled, utterly satisfied with himself. "Excellent. I knew I could count on your professionalism." I let exactly 1 week pass. I used those 5 business days to quietly back up every single personal file, wipe my digital footprint from the internal servers, and organize my desk into a sterile, anonymous space. Then came the following Tuesday. Exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I stood up, walked across the floor, and stepped into Owen's office without knocking. He was looking at his monitors, a frown line creasing his forehead. I placed a crisp, bright white envelope squarely in the center of his keyboard. He glanced down at it, then up at me, his frown deepening into genuine confusion. "What is this?" "That is my formal 2-week notice of resignation," I said, my voice as steady and cold as a winter morning. "My final day at Briargate will be 14 days from today." Owen stared at me for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he laughed. It was a short, breathy sound of absolute disbelief. He leaned back in his chair, shifting from confusion to a sneer of arrogant disdain. "Emory, really?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "Are you throwing a tantrum right now? Are you honestly acting out of emotion over a simple staffing decision? This is exactly why I needed a fresh perspective on the project. You are taking a standard corporate restructuring as a personal insult. It is highly unprofessional." I did not break eye contact. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the back of the leather chair. "I am not reacting with emotion, Owen," I said, every word meticulously weighed and delivered with absolute precision. "I am reacting with the exact clarity of a person who just watched her net worth being sold at a massive discount by someone who does not understand the market. You wanted a transition. You have 2 weeks. I turned and walked out of the office before he could formulate a response. I did not look back to see the color drain from his face as the reality of my words hit him. I walked straight to my desk, sat down, and opened my draft folder. I had 3 emails waiting, meticulously composed and legally reviewed. The first was addressed to the Chief Legal Counsel at Marston Home & Style. The second was to the Integration Director at Crescent Scanware. The third was to the Routing Administrator at Blue Lattice Carrier Network. The subject lines were identical: formal notification of continuity leadership transfer. The body of the email stated, in clear, undeniable legal terms, that the designated senior operating architect overseeing their accounts would be permanently separating from Briargate Commerce Systems in exactly 14 days. It requested their immediate compliance protocols to handle the disruption. I highlighted all 3 drafts and clicked send. The trap was no longer set. It had officially sprung. The final 2 weeks of my employment were a masterclass in malicious compliance. I was perfectly, agonizingly professional. I attended every required handover meeting with Ivy. I handed over every single mandatory legal document. I organized the shared network drives into immaculate, brightly color-coded folders. I wrote extensively polite, grammatically perfect handover notes detailing the basic, surface-level functions of the software. But I did absolutely nothing else. I was contractually obligated to leave my work files. I was not contractually obligated to leave my mind. I did not write down the unwritten rules. I did not explain the historical context behind the bizarre code exceptions. When Ivy asked me why a specific routing logic bypassed a certain warehouse on Tuesdays, I simply smiled, pointed to the standard operating procedure manual, and told her the basic logic was documented. I did not tell her that the manual was utterly useless when the carrier's application programming interface failed, a scenario that only my undocumented proprietary failsafe could catch. I watched them scramble. I watched Owen try to project calm while the legal departments of our three biggest partners began demanding immediate risk assessment meetings. I watched Ivy stare blankly at cascading screens of data she had demanded to control but could not comprehend. They had wanted the stage all to themselves. Now they had it. The curtain was rising, the spotlights were blinding, and they were standing there entirely alone, utterly unprepared for the crushing weight of the performance. I packed my final box, turned in my keycard, and walked out the front doors into the warm afternoon air, leaving them to the magnificent disaster they had so aggressively demanded. My only job now was to wait for the collapse. The first morning I woke up without an alarm in over a decade. Briargate did not immediately burst into flames. Structural collapses rarely happen in a single, spectacular explosion. They begin with microscopic fractures, silent stress points snapping under pressure until the entire edifice gives way. At 9 o'clock that Monday, Ivy attempted her first real executive action. She logged into the primary dashboard and submitted the formal request to activate the production lane for the new system. It was supposed to be a triumphant push of a button. Instead, she hit a solid concrete wall. The automated request bounced back instantly from Blue Lattice Carrier Network. The status indicator flashed a harsh crimson red, displaying a hard suspension notice. The network protocols rigidly enforced the continuity parameter I had warned them about. Because the client had not formally approved a new leadership profile, the carrier refused to open the data pipeline. Down on the development floor, the engineering team assumed it was merely a bureaucratic delay. They figured someone in legal had forgotten to sign a digital document. To keep the momentum going, the lead developer instructed the team to reroute the deployment into an extended sandbox test environment. They wanted to simulate the live load while they waited for the paperwork to clear. That was their first fatal mistake. As soon as they bypassed the live gateway, the internal data mapping started to drift. Without my proprietary exception, libraries actively filtering the incoming noise, the system began misinterpreting basic return codes. A damaged television marked for disposal was suddenly categorized as pristine restocking inventory. A lost shipment that required a full refund was routed into a perpetual holding queue. Compounding the disaster, Crescent Scanware's automated security protocols locked the entire hardware network. When Ivy tried to reboot the physical warehouse scanners to force an update, the third-party system demanded an administrator override. But the primary architect account had been permanently disabled by the Human Resources Department the previous Friday. Crescent refused to issue a new encryption key because Briargate could not produce a valid countersigned transfer document. The demonstration environment did not crash, which was actually the worst possible outcome. If the servers had simply died, they would have stopped the test. Instead, the software kept running, processing thousands of simulated transactions per minute. To the untrained eye of a 24-year-old intern staring at a high-level dashboard, everything looked like it was functioning. The green lights kept blinking. But beneath the surface, the return figures, the refund fee calculations, and the physical warehouse routing logic were silently corrupting, layer by catastrophic layer. They were building a massive house of cards on a foundation of quicksand. By Tuesday afternoon, the financial reality of the delay began to surface. Miles Bennett, the chief financial officer, was a man who lived entirely within the margins of his spreadsheets. When he ran the projected cost analysis of a delayed rollout, the numbers drained the color from his face. If the new platform was stalled by just 2 additional weeks, Briargate would be forced to absorb exorbitant manual processing penalties from their third-party warehouse partners. Furthermore, the excess inventory holding fees would skyrocket. Miles calculated that a 14-day delay would consume nearly 80% of the projected profit for the entire quarter. Panic began to seep into the executive suites. Owen, however, refused to acknowledge the gravity of his own engineered disaster. He called an emergency leadership huddle and aggressively downplayed the mounting errors. "This is nothing but short-term noise," Owen insisted, pacing around the glass-walled meeting room. "We are experiencing standard friction. Every major software launch has a few deployment hiccups. We just need to throw some temporary muscle at the problem to smooth out the transition." Instead of pausing the deployment to audit the foundational code, Owen doubled down on his mistake. He authorized an emergency contract with an elite, external software consulting firm based in Atlanta. He agreed to a completely exorbitant hourly rate, desperate to quietly patch the bleeding before the investor showcase. He brought in a team of highly paid strangers to fix a machine they had never seen before. The Atlanta consultants arrived virtually on Wednesday morning, charging thousands of dollars an hour. They dug into the repository, confident they could untangle the mess. By day 3 of their contract, they slammed into a brick wall they could not climb. They had traced the mapping drift to a massive, convoluted chain of logic exceptions buried deep within the routing protocols. It was a bizarre, highly unorthodox patch of code that defied standard development practices. The consultants complained that it was entirely undocumented. They were right. It was undocumented. I had written that specific logic sequence during a massive data crisis in the summer of 2021. At the time, a major server outage at the client level had threatened to duplicate 50,000 refund requests. In the middle of the night, I had engineered a highly complex, temporary shortcut to safely route the ghost data away from the financial ledgers. I never documented it because standard documentation would have flagged it as an error to the automated auditing software. Only I understood both the Briargate architecture and the client's internal quirks well enough to know why that specific shortcut had to exist, and exactly how it interacted with the rest of the ecosystem. The consultants from Atlanta were staring at a foreign language they had no dictionary to translate. The failure of the expensive hired guns finally broke the illusion of control. The internal finger-pointing began, and the legal department realized the immense liability sitting on their servers. At 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, my cell phone rang. I was sitting at the small, pristine desk of my newly leased office space, reviewing the Incorporation documents for my consulting firm. The caller ID displayed the name Nora Feld. She was the general counsel for Briargate, a sharp, usually aggressive corporate lawyer who never made social calls. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "This is Emory," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Good afternoon, Emory," Nora said. Her voice was uncharacteristically tight, heavily guarded, and laced with extreme caution. "I hope you are transitioning well into your next chapter." "I am doing exceptionally well. Nora, what can I help you with?" I could hear the faint hum of the Briargate ventilation system in the background of the call. She was likely calling from a soundproof conference room, probably with Owen hovering nervously nearby. "We are currently finalizing the back-end audit for the new release," Nora continued, choosing her words with agonizing care to avoid admitting any liability. "The engineering team has encountered a minor hurdle regarding the historical logic branches. Specifically, the exception routing from the third quarter of 2021. We were wondering if, perhaps, there was any supplemental documentation that was accidentally left out of your final handoff folder." It was a beautifully constructed trap. If I admitted I had forgotten something, I would be in breach of my exit agreement. If I gave them the answer for free, I would validate their belief that my expertise was a company asset they could access at their convenience. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the afternoon traffic. "Nora, I can assure you that everything I was legally obligated to hand over as an employee of Briargate was meticulously categorized and transferred prior to my departure," I replied, my voice perfectly polite and utterly unyielding. My handover notes were comprehensive regarding all standard operating procedures and owned intellectual property. There was a long, heavy pause on the line. Nora knew exactly what my answer meant. The gap in their system was not an oversight. It was the boundary line of my proprietary knowledge. "I see," Nora finally said, the strain in her voice becoming more pronounced. "So, to be clear, There are no other files we can access to resolve this specific architecture path. As an employee, my obligations are fulfilled, I stated clearly. However, if Briargate finds itself requiring deep, specialized consulting knowledge to untangle legacy architecture outside the scope of my former employment duties, I would be more than happy to assist. As the principal director of Ramirez Flow Advisory, I am currently taking on new clients. I am perfectly willing to send over my standard rate card and an independent contractor agreement for your review. The silence that followed was absolute. I had just taken their desperate plea for a free lifeline and transformed it into a commercial transaction. I was no longer the loyal subordinate they could command. I was a vendor, and my price had just gone up. I will discuss that option with the executive team, Nora said stiffly. Thank you for your time, Emory. You are very welcome. Nora, have a wonderful afternoon. I disconnected the call and placed the phone gently on the desk. The first cracks had officially split the foundation wide open. They were bleeding money. Their hired experts were paralyzed, and the legal department was finally waking up to the nightmare. And the best part was, the client had not even noticed the smoke yet. Exactly 3 weeks after my security badge was permanently deactivated, the external pressure finally breached the reinforced hull of Briargate Commerce Systems. The collapse did not originate from the internal engineering floor, nor did it come from a panicked vendor. The fatal blow came directly from the summit of the revenue chain. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when my private office phone vibrated against the polished wood of my desk. I did not recognize the incoming number, but the area code belonged to the corporate headquarters of Marston Home and Style. I answered the call, fully expecting a frantic low-level compliance officer trying to locate a missing digital signature. "This is Emory," I said smoothly. "Emory, it is Leah Whitmore." The sound of her voice made me sit up perfectly straight in my chair. Leah Whitmore was the chief operating officer of Marston. She was a notoriously ruthless, brilliantly analytical executive who governed a multi-billion-dollar retail empire with zero tolerance for incompetence. Over the past 4 years, I had stood shoulder to shoulder with Leah during 3 separate supply chain crises. She knew exactly who had kept her seasonal rollouts from imploding. "Good morning, Leah," I replied, my tone shifting into the measured, professional cadence we had always shared. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I am bypassing your former chief executive completely," Leah stated, her voice sharp and devoid of pleasantries. "Owen Mercer is currently screening my calls through his executive assistant, which tells me everything I need to know about the state of his organization. I am calling you because you are the only person who has never lied to me about my data." I remained silent, allowing her the space to lay out the disaster. In the last 14 days, Briargate has postponed 2 critical performance demonstrations. Leah continued, the absolute fury simmering just beneath her controlled delivery. Yesterday, they finally managed to run a simulated load test for our upcoming holiday volume. It was an unmitigated disaster. Emory, the refund reconciliation data did not match the physical inventory logs. They were showing millions of dollars in ghost returns that simply did not exist in our regional distribution centers. I closed my eyes, visualizing the exact point of failure within the routing architecture. Ivy and the external consultants were blindly forcing data through pathways that were completely detached from the physical reality of the warehouses. Then, Leah dropped a revelation that made my blood run completely cold. "But the data mapping drift is only a secondary issue," Leah said tightly. "What I want to know is why the artificial intelligence fraud prediction module is aggressively flagging legitimate high-tier customers for manual review. Owen promised us that the predictive algorithm was fully integrated and ready to slash our chargeback rates. Right now, it is freezing legitimate transactions and threatening to destroy our consumer trust." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. My mind raced backward through the developmental timeline of Project Holloway. "Leah," I asked carefully, ensuring my voice betrayed absolutely no shock, "did Owen Mercer formally sell you an active, production-ready artificial intelligence prediction layer?" "He presented it to our board of directors exactly 1 month ago," Leah confirmed. her tone turning dangerously cold. He explicitly stated it was the crown jewel of the Holloway architecture. A deep, profound sense of horror washed over me, quickly followed by the sharp realization of Owen's massive, unforgivable mistake. The artificial intelligence fraud module was not a finished product. It was a highly experimental, internal sandbox pilot. I had built a rudimentary machine learning script to analyze return patterns, but it was months away from being safe for a live retail environment. It required millions of historical data points to avoid catastrophic false positives. Putting that raw, untested algorithm in front of real Marston customers was like handing a loaded weapon to a toddler. This was no longer just a case of executive exaggeration. This was fraudulent misrepresentation. Owen had sold a massive, publicly traded partner a phantom capability to inflate his own value, risking immense legal liability if Marston acted on the faulty data the algorithm generated. "Leah, I cannot speak to the current operational decisions at Briargate," I replied carefully, navigating the legal boundaries of my non-disclosure obligations. "However, I can assure you that when I designed the roadmap for Holloway, any predictive modeling was strictly designated for controlled internal testing. It was explicitly not cleared for production deployment." Leah let out a long, hard breath. It was the sound of an executive making a terminal decision. "I knew it," she said quietly. "He sold us vaporware to lock in the contract extension. Listen to me very closely. Emory, the holiday season begins in less than 60 days. I am instructing my legal counsel to draft a formal notice of termination for cause. If Briargate cannot restore absolute control of this system to someone who actually understands the architectural reality, Marston is walking away. We will pull our entire contract before I let an untested algorithm destroy my peak season." "I understand," I said. "Keep your phone on, Emory," Leah added, the implication hanging heavily in the air. Then, she disconnected the line. The shockwaves of Leah's threat were not the only things battering Briargate's defenses. Through secure, encrypted messaging channels, the reality of the internal chaos was being fed directly to my private server. 2 senior operations managers, veterans who had fought in the trenches with me for years, had remained fiercely loyal. They knew the ship was sinking, and they were quietly funneling the proof out the back door. According to their latest dispatches, a massive secondary processing facility in Tennessee had just formally notified Briargate of severe financial penalties. Because the new software updates had failed to properly encode the advanced shipping notices, the warehouse staff was forced to manually scan tens of thousands of individual pallets. The facility was legally entitled to charge an exorbitant manual processing fee for every single unit. The invoices were piling up, bleeding the operational budget dry in a matter of days. The internal culture at Briargate had rapidly devolved into a vicious cycle of scapegoating. Ivy Sloane, terrified and entirely out of her depth, had abandoned her confident persona. She spent her days drafting panicked memos, aggressively blaming the system failures on the legacy mess left behind by the older generation of engineers. She claimed the code was inherently defective, refusing to admit she simply did not know how to steer the ship. Owen, desperate to maintain his narrative, echoed her complaints to the board. He repeatedly insisted that the transition was only difficult because I had intentionally made the architecture convoluted to protect my own job. But my loyalists inside the company ensured that Owen's lies would not survive the light of day. Late that Tuesday evening, a heavily encrypted compressed file arrived in my inbox. I opened the file and found a goldmine of corporate espionage. It contained the unedited minutes from executive steering committee meetings, detailed internal project timelines, and a highly damning chain of emails between Owen and the legal department. In those emails, dated weeks before my resignation, the internal counsel explicitly warned Owen about the severe compliance risks of forcefully removing me from the Marston account without formal continuity approvals. Owen's written response was dismissive, stating they would simply ask for forgiveness rather than permission, prioritizing the optics of Ivy's promotion over the legal safety of the enterprise. He had been warned, clearly and repeatedly, and he had chosen his own ego over the survival of the company. I printed the most critical documents and laid them out across my desk. The picture was complete. Briargate was suffocating under the weight of manual processing fees. They were legally exposed by a fabricated artificial intelligence product, and their largest client was actively preparing to detonate the entire partnership. I picked up my pen and signed the final page of my commercial lease agreement. I officially incorporated Ramirez Flow Advisory that afternoon. I did not start my own firm out of a petty, emotional desire for revenge. Emotion makes people sloppy. Emotion makes people accept lowball apologies. I built this advisory firm for one specific, razor-sharp purpose. I was preparing the absolute perfect vessel for the exact moment when the executives at Briargate were finally backed into a corner, completely out of options, and forced to pay an astronomical premium for the very value they had arrogantly assumed they could use for free for 12 long years. The trap had closed. Now, I just had to wait for them to realize they could not chew their way out. The highly anticipated investor preview arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon. Briargate had rented a lavish ballroom at a downtown luxury hotel, pouring tens of thousands of dollars into open bars, ambient lighting, and high-end catering. But the extravagant set dressing could not mask the profound rot actively spreading beneath the floorboards. When the room dimmed and the sales director transitioned the presentation to the live software demonstration, the manufactured energy in the room instantly evaporated. On the massive projection screen, the primary dashboard of Project Holloway attempted to load a real-time visualization of the warehouse return queues. Instead of a smooth, cascading flow of operational data, the interface seized entirely. A cascade of stark, crimson error notifications flooded the screen, overlapping each other in a frantic, unreadable display of system panic. The logic engine was attempting to process concurrent return orders for the identical physical items, creating a catastrophic, infinite loop of inventory collisions right in front of the largest shareholders. The interface began to stutter violently, the refresh rate lagging as the servers choked on the broken code. The head of sales, his face flushed a deep shade of magenta, practically lunged across the podium and abruptly severed the video feed. He loudly declared into the microphone that they were experiencing a minor, localized hotel network connectivity issue. It was a pathetic, completely transparent lie, and the dead silence from the audience confirmed that nobody believed a single word. The tension fully crystallized during the final question and answer segment. A veteran supply chain reporter for a major retail trade publication stood up in the third row. He did not ask about the glaring dashboard error. He aimed for a much softer, far more lethal target. "Owen," the reporter asked, his voice carrying clearly without the aid of a microphone, "you spent the last 2 quarters hyping this new architecture as the definitive operational breakthrough of the year. Yet, industry sources are indicating that the go-live date for Marston Home & Style has been quietly delayed multiple times. Can you explain the disconnect between your aggressive marketing narrative and the actual deployment schedule?" Owen gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly, his knuckles turned a stark white. He offered a strained, meandering answer about cautious integration periods and phased rollout safety measures. But the damage was irreversible. The investors shifted uncomfortably in their expensive seats. They could smell blood in the water. While the company hemorrhaged public credibility at the hotel, the internal financial arteries were being completely severed. Miles Bennett sat alone in his sterile office, staring at the month-end reconciliation reports until his vision literally blurred. The raw numbers were catastrophic. In less than 30 days, the total financial burn rate for the external Atlanta consulting firm, combined with the brutal manual processing overtime out of the secondary facilities and the cascading auxiliary operational penalties, had entirely vaporized the original project budget. They had spent what was supposed to last 6 full months in less than 4 weeks. The projected quarterly profit margins were not just taking a temporary hit, they were being actively, aggressively erased. The scent of a dying vendor travels incredibly fast in the corporate logistics world. 2 days after the disastrous investor preview, My private business line rang twice in the span of 3 hours. The first call was from the Vice President of Operations at Northline Outfitters. The second was from the Logistics Director at Belmere Living. Both companies were solid, highly profitable mid-tier clients of Briargate. Neither executive mentioned the software glitches directly. Instead, they spoke in the careful, heavily coded language of professionals looking to secure a lifeboat before the ship completely submerged. They wanted to casually explore my availability for private, independent advisory contracts, just in case their current service provider experienced any prolonged structural instability. I politely took their information, quoted them my highest premium retainer rate, and promised to keep our exploratory conversations strictly confidential. For a textbook narcissist like Owen, the most agonizing part of the collapse was the complete lack of a massive public spectacle. He could have fought a loud, aggressive battle against a vicious tabloid smear campaign. He thrived on combative corporate warfare, but this professional execution was entirely silent. There were no angry press releases. There were no dramatic public resignations to rail against. Instead, there was just the quiet, lethal hum of industry gossip. During private golf games, closed-door steakhouse dinners, and hushed conversations at supply chain conferences across the coast, the narrative hardened into concrete. The market had collectively realized that the chief executive of Briargate had traded a brilliant veteran operator for a photogenic showpiece, and the entire company was paying the ultimate price. Owen was rapidly becoming a cautionary tale, a punchline whispered among his peers. Inside the suffocating walls of the Briargate executive suite, the designated showpiece was finally waking up to her grim reality. Ivy Sloane was initially naive, blinded by the sudden ambition and the intoxicating rush of completely unearned authority, but she was not inherently stupid. As the hostile stares from the exhausted engineering department multiplied and the panic in Owen's voice grew significantly sharper, the golden veneer of her rapid promotion peeled away. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that she had never been elevated to lead the department. She had been positioned specifically to absorb the inevitable impact. She was the human shield for a massive political gamble that the chief executive had entirely fabricated. Driven by a sudden, desperate sense of self-preservation, Ivy locked herself in her office long after the rest of the floor had gone home. She abandoned her usual, highly organized habit of maintaining a perfectly clean inbox and began digging frantically through the archived communication servers. She pulled up the historical calendar invitations, the old project timelines, and the buried thread histories from the months prior to my departure. She found absolutely everything. She uncovered the dense, meticulously detailed warnings I had sent directly to the Executive Steering Committee regarding the rigid legal boundaries of the client continuity clauses. She read the stark, uncompromising assessments I had provided about the unfinished, highly volatile state of the artificial intelligence prediction layer. She found my repeated, explicitly documented refusals to authorize a public demonstration before the final testing phases were entirely complete. Owen had looked her directly in the eye and told her the legacy system was perfectly ready to launch. The unalterable digital archives proved he had lied to her face. He had driven the corporate ship directly into a naval minefield and handed her the steering wheel just seconds before the explosion. Ivy stopped deleting her daily emails. Instead, she created a hidden, heavily encrypted folder on her personal hard drive. She systematically downloaded every single piece of correspondence that proved the executive team had been fully aware of the catastrophic risks. She was quietly packing her own parachute, preparing a watertight, undeniable defense for the inevitable moment the board of directors demanded a human sacrifice. I observed this entire, spectacular disintegration from the quiet sanctuary of my rented office space. My new headquarters was modest, leased on a simple month-to-month agreement, furnished with nothing more than a solid desk, a comfortable leather chair, and a massive white dry erase board tracking my new leads. I did not need a lavish boardroom or a catered breakfast to feel powerful. I sat by the window, sipping black coffee, tracking the frantic market signals like a seasoned meteorologist watching a massive pressure system collapse on a radar screen. I was completely removed from the chaos, standing safely on high ground while the hurricane battered the vulnerable coast. I knew exactly where the eye of the storm was heading, and I knew exactly who was going to be left standing in the wreckage when the final wave crashed. By the end of the 6th week, following my quiet departure, the executive floor of Briargate Commerce Systems felt less like a corporate headquarters and significantly more like a pressurized submarine slowly imploding at the bottom of the ocean. The illusion of control had completely evaporated. Marla Klein, the formidable chair of the board of directors, was not a woman who tolerated theatrical management or prolonged incompetence. When she summoned an emergency executive session late that Friday afternoon, she stripped away every single trapping of corporate comfort. There was no casual banter in the hallway. There were no expensive catered pastries or artisanal coffee blends waiting on the credenza. There were no bright, inspirational slide decks queued up on the projector. There was only the long, freezing expanse of the polished oak boardroom table, stark overhead lighting, and the suffocating, undeniable weight of a massive failure. General Counsel Nora Feld stood rigidly at the head of the table. She did not bother to connect her laptop to the display screen. She held a single, heavily tabbed manila folder. When she spoke, her voice was entirely devoid of the careful, diplomatic padding she usually employed around the executive suite. It was the sharp, clinical tone of a surgeon declaring a patient legally dead. "We have uncovered a severe, foundational liability regarding the operational architecture of our new deployment," Nora began, looking directly at Marla and deliberately ignoring Owen Mercer, who sat rigidly near the center of the table. "The core return decision framework, the proprietary exception libraries, the routing logic, and the essential architectural documentation that this entire system relies upon were never legally transferred to Briargate." A low, confused murmur rippled through the seated board members. Marla held up a single hand, silencing the room instantly. "Explain that to me in plain English." "Nora," Marla commanded. "Are you telling this board that we do not own the software we are currently trying to sell?" "I am telling you that we possess mere digital copies of the operational files," Nora clarified, her words slicing through the heavy air. "However, the full commercial usage rights to the underlying operational logic belong exclusively to the former senior architect. According to an addendum in the original employment contract drafted 12 years ago, any custom framework she developed remained her exclusive intellectual property unless this specific board of directors passed a formal resolution of transfer prior to her separation from the company. That resolution never happened." Nora paused, turning her head just enough to direct her next sentence directly at the chief executive. "That specific contract was fully executed, reviewed, and signed by Owen. It appears he never bothered to read the stipulations carefully before authorizing her employment." Owen opened his mouth to defend himself, his face flushing a dark, angry crimson, but Nora did not give him the oxygen. She simply turned a page in her folder and delivered the next lethal blow. "Furthermore," Nora continued relentlessly, "I have received formal notification that our anchor client has refused to sign the continuity approval documents transferring leadership to the new project owner. Consequently, if we attempt to force this unverified system into a live production environment under the current staffing arrangement, we will be in immediate, actionable breach of our master service agreement. It will trigger an automatic contract dispute." Miles Bennett, the chief financial officer, did not wait for an invitation to speak. He leaned forward, pushing a single, starkly printed spreadsheet toward the center of the table. He looked physically ill, the dark circles under his eyes a testament to weeks of sleepless nights trying to hide the bleeding. "The financial exposure is no longer containable," Miles stated, his voice trembling slightly. "The exorbitant hourly fees for the external consultants in Atlanta, combined with the catastrophic manual processing penalties we are absorbing from our secondary warehouses, are bleeding our cash reserves dry. But that is merely the symptom. The terminal disease is the banking covenant." Miles tapped a perfectly manicured finger against the paper. If our anchor client executes a termination for cause, we lose nearly 18% of our total annual revenue overnight. Our primary lender has a strict revenue threshold written into our commercial credit agreement. If that client walks away, the bank will immediately freeze our operational credit line. We will not be able to make payroll by the end of the fiscal quarter. The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. It was the sound of incredibly wealthy, powerful people realizing that their golden goose had not just stopped laying eggs, it had been actively poisoned by the man they hired to feed it. Right at that exact moment of absolute despair, Ivy Sloane stood up. She was sitting at the far end of the table, looking incredibly young and entirely out of place among the hardened executives. But her hands were completely steady as she lifted a thick stack of printed documents from her leather portfolio and began sliding copies down the length of the oak table. "I believe the board needs to review these," Ivy said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the dead silent room. Marla picked up the top packet. "What exactly are we looking at?" "Ivy. Those are the internal email chains, meeting minutes, and archived calendar invitations from the final 2 months prior to the resignation," Ivy explained, refusing to look at Owen. "They contain detailed, comprehensive warnings." The former architect explicitly outlined the severe legal boundaries regarding the client continuity clauses. She documented the highly volatile, unfinished state of the artificial intelligence prediction models. She repeatedly stated, in writing, that the system would fracture catastrophically if we attempted to demonstrate it before the testing phases were complete. Ivy took a slow, deep breath, her survival instinct overriding any lingering loyalty she held for the man who had set her up to fail. "I did not know these warnings existed until recently," Ivy confessed, her voice hardening. "I was instructed to ignore the legacy protocols. Owen explicitly told me that my promotion was required because the company needed a younger, more dynamic face to improve the corporate narrative for the investors. He pushed me to lead a highly complex technical integration I was not qualified for, specifically to serve as a cosmetic transition. Despite knowing the absolute operational risks involved, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The board members stopped looking at the financial spreadsheets and started reading the printed emails. The damning, undeniable paper trail lay right in front of them. The sheer gravity of the situation finally slammed into the executives. This was no longer a tragic technical glitch or a clumsy human resources transition. This was an intentional, catastrophic failure of executive governance. It was a conscious, reckless gamble disguised by flashy marketing language and empty corporate buzzwords. Marla slowly lowered the printed emails to the table. Her eyes were completely dead as she stared across the expanse of wood at Owen. She did not yell. She did not throw the papers. She simply turned her attention back to the general counsel. "Nora," Marla asked, her voice dangerously calm, "are there any legal avenues available to us that do not involve actively negotiating a surrender to a former employee?" "We could attempt to file an injunction," Nora replied, her tone matching Marla's cold pragmatism. "We could try to litigate the intellectual property ownership in federal court. However, I must advise the board that it would be a completely frivolous maneuver. We would burn millions of dollars in external legal fees. The discovery process would take many months. We would absolutely lose the anchor client within a matter of days, and we would lose the lawsuit long before we ever secured a trial date. Her foundational contract is utterly ironclad." Owen finally slammed his hand flat against the table, desperate to break the suffocating consensus forming against him. "You are all completely losing perspective," Owen argued, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. "This is just one single project. We have a massive portfolio of other accounts. We have the internal engineering talent to build a workaround. We just need to manage the client relationship and buy ourselves a few weeks to rewrite the logic." For the first time in his entire tenure as the chief executive officer, nobody argued with him. Nobody nodded in agreement. Nobody even bothered to correct his wildly inaccurate assessment of the engineering timeline. The board members simply stared at him. The expensive suit, the confident posture, and the charismatic smile no longer functioned. The brutal, unforgiving truth had walked into the boardroom and stripped him entirely bare. Looking at his desperate, sweating face, every single person in that room simultaneously realized that Owen Mercer had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. He was a hollow salesman standing in the middle of a burning factory, trying to convince the owners that the smoke was just a new type of modern lighting. My private office was quiet on Tuesday afternoon, save for the low hum of the air conditioner and the scratch of my dry erase marker. I was standing in front of the large whiteboard mounted on the far wall, carefully updating the status columns for the 3 major prospective clients I was currently courting. My cell phone began to vibrate against the glass surface of my desk. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Owen Mercer's name flashing on the screen. I did not stop writing. I let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. 10 minutes later, it rang again. I ignored it a second time. I ignored the third attempt, and then the fourth. I was deliberately establishing the new cadence of our relationship. I was no longer an employee at his beck and call, terrified of missing a summons to the executive suite. I was an independent consultant, and my time was expensive. When the phone lit up for the 5th time, I finally walked over, picked it up, and pressed the green button. Ramirez Flow Advisory, this is Emory, I answered, my tone crisp, professional, and entirely detached. Emory? Hello, Owen began. His voice was jarringly soft, completely lacking the booming, manufactured authority he usually projected across a boardroom. It was the voice of a man trying very hard to sound like a reasonable friend instead of a desperate executive. Thank you for picking up. I know you are busy getting your new venture off the ground. I let the silence hang, forcing him to fill the uncomfortable void. Listen, Owen continued, clearing his throat nervously. We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence with the new deployment. Nothing we cannot handle internally in the long run, of course. But the board and I agree that it might be beneficial to bring in a short-term bridge to get us through this localized rough patch. I was hoping you might be willing to be flexible for the common good and offer some limited advisory hours to help Ivy stabilize the legacy connections. He was still trying to frame it as a minor favor, a casual request to help out the team. I looked up at my whiteboard. Beneath the names of the 3 massive retail chains, I had mapped out a very specific pricing structure for this exact phone call. I am certainly available to accept new clients. Owen, I replied smoothly, pulling a printed legal document from a pristine file folder. I can send over my standard emergency remediation contract by the end of the business day. However, given the extreme structural risks currently present in your environment, my terms are non-negotiable. We are prepared to offer your previous hourly rate, plus a 20% premium for the inconvenience, Owen offered, trying to sound generous. My advisory firm does not bill by the hour, I corrected him. I require a fixed monthly retainer. That retainer is exactly 2.5 times the total annual compensation package I received during my final year at Briargate, prorated for a minimum 6-month engagement. Additionally, since your general counsel has likely informed you that I retain full intellectual property rights to the core operational framework, Briargate will also need to pay a separate 6-figure licensing fee for the continued commercial use of my proprietary exception libraries. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, but I did not stop speaking. I was systematically dismantling his remaining leverage. Furthermore, I require absolute veto power and approval rights over the entire operational roadmap for Project Holloway until the system is fully stabilized. I continued. I will not be held liable for the catastrophic mistakes of an inexperienced intern. I also require a strict mutual non-disparagement clause, the unrestricted right to communicate directly with your key enterprise clients without Briargate management present, and a formal, legally binding letter signed by the board of directors officially recognizing me as the sole original lead architect of the Holloway system. Finally, the licensing fee and the first 3 months of the retainer must be paid in full, via wire transfer, before I will even look at a single line of your code. The line was dead silent for 10 seconds. When Owen finally spoke, His voice was tight with barely suppressed rage. "That is absolutely outrageous," he hissed. "You are trying to hold this company hostage. No reasonable consultant charges those kinds of extortionate fees for a few weeks of transition work. You are fundamentally misunderstanding the transaction." "Owen," I said, my voice completely devoid of anger or triumph. It was just cold, hard business. "You are not buying a few weeks of my time. You are buying the 12 years of accumulated operational mastery that you arrogantly assumed you could replace with a pretty slide deck and a 24-year-old intern. The price reflects the exact cost of saving your company from the disaster you personally engineered. You have the terms. Let me know what your board decides." I hung up the phone. I did not wait for a counteroffer because I knew he had none to give. 2 hours later, my secure banking portal sent an automated notification to my laptop. The notification was not from Briargate. It was a massive, 6-figure wire transfer from the corporate accounts of Marston Home and Style. Leah Whitmore had made her move. It was a preemptive, secondary retainer. Marston was formally securing my independent services on standby, guaranteeing my availability, just in case Briargate completely collapsed and the retailer was forced to rip the entire rollout away from them and manage it directly through my firm. They were placing their bets, and their money was entirely on me. The final devastating reality check for Owen did not happen in a boardroom. It happened exactly 2 weeks later, under the bright fluorescent lights of a massive supply chain technology conference in downtown Atlanta. The convention center was packed with thousands of industry executives, vendor representatives, and retail strategists. I had rented a small, elegant private meeting room just off the main exhibition floor. I sat at a glass table across from the Chief Operating Officer of North Key Commerce, one of Briargate's most aggressive and well-funded regional competitors. They had watched the quiet chaos engulfing Owen's company and immediately recognized the massive vulnerability in the market. They wanted to use my exact operational blueprint to scale their own fulfillment network and steal Briargate's dissatisfied clients. I handed the executive a silver pen. He smiled warmly, signed the bottom of the comprehensive advisory contract, and slid the heavy document back across the table. It was a multi-year deal worth several $100,000. We stood up and shook hands. As I turned to leave the glass-walled room, I looked out into the crowded corridor. Standing less than 30 feet away, frozen in place, was Owen Mercer. He had a promotional Briargate lanyard around his neck, looking thoroughly exhausted. He was staring directly at me, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. He saw the North Key executive. He saw the thick contract. He saw the handshake. Worse still, standing directly next to Owen was one of his own senior board members, a man who had flown down to Atlanta specifically to monitor the company's deteriorating market presence. I watched the board member follow Owen's terrified gaze. I saw the exact moment the older man recognized me, and then recognized the competitor I was doing business with. The board member turned to Owen, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Owen truly understood his fatal miscalculation. As long as I was sitting in a cubicle inside his building, he viewed me as a depreciating expense, a stubborn employee he could bully into submission. But standing out here, in the open market, the illusion was shattered. I was no longer an insubordinate ex-employee. I was a highly coveted, fiercely contested market asset. When Owen flew back to Charlotte that evening, he was a broken executive. He could no longer stand in front of his board and project his usual arrogant certainty. He could no longer pretend that my demands were unreasonable or that Briargate held the high ground. Because now, the board had witnessed the truth with their own eyes. They knew their chief executive was desperately trying to haggle over the price of a lifeboat, while their biggest rivals were happily paying top dollar to buy the entire fleet. They were out of time, out of leverage, and completely out of excuses. With fewer than 10 days remaining before the entire retail industry initiated their mandatory holiday system freezes, Briargate Commerce Systems found itself backed against a concrete wall of its own making. The suffocating pressure of the impending peak season left the executive team staring down exactly 3 possible avenues of survival. The first option was the most logical: accept my non-negotiable terms, pay the exorbitant licensing fees, and surrender complete operational control back to my independent advisory firm. The second option was the most honest stand before their furious investors and the board of directors, confess that Project Holloway was a catastrophic failure, and beg for a massive extension. Naturally, Owen Mercer chose the third option. Owen was fundamentally incapable of surrender or honesty. He was the type of corporate leader who would rather slap a fresh coat of high-gloss paint over a deeply fractured load-bearing wall than admit the entire building was actively shaking. Driven by a toxic cocktail of sheer panic and indestructible arrogance, he decided to gamble the entire existence of his company on one massive, fabricated spectacle. He ordered the immediate organization of a grandiose live showcase event at a premier corporate venue right in the heart of Charlotte. He invited Marston home in style, the primary banking partners, the most aggressive investors, and a dozen prospective enterprise clients. His ultimate goal was to aggressively control the narrative, determined to prove that Project Holloway was perfectly robust and ready to save the fiscal year. Behind the heavily soundproofed doors of the executive suite, the board of directors was profoundly uneasy. Marla Klein and the other senior members had seen the damning paper trail. They knew the foundation was fundamentally compromised. However, they were completely paralyzed by the ticking clock. They did not have enough time to officially lock down the event or publicly cancel the showcase without triggering an immediate, fatal panic in the market. Owen had aggressively sold this presentation to the shareholders as the ultimate opportunity to regain market trust and silence the swirling industry rumors. Stopping him now would look like an admission of absolute guilt. They were strapped into the passenger seats of a speeding vehicle, watching the driver accelerate directly toward a cliff. While Owen approved catering menus and rehearsed his charismatic talking points, a quiet, desperate crime was taking place down in the engineering department. The technical team, driven to the brink of exhaustion and operating under direct threatening orders from the chief executive, took a terrifying risk. They isolated an old, fragmented digital copy of my proprietary exception library from a dusty backup server. It was the exact intellectual property I legally owned and had explicitly forbidden them from using without a commercial license. They forcefully grafted this bootlegged, outdated code into the live demonstration environment, hoping it would act as a temporary tourniquet to stop the data from bleeding out during the presentation. Nora Feld, the general counsel, caught wind of the maneuver the night before the event. She stormed into Owen's office, her usual composed demeanor entirely shattered. "You are actively directing this company into the realm of undeniable intellectual property theft," Nora stated, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Using an unlicensed copy of her framework to deceive our stakeholders is a monumental compliance violation. It crosses the line from gross negligence into willful, actionable fraud." Owen dismissed her entirely. He told her to stop acting like an alarmist and focus on protecting the brand. He believed that if the demonstration succeeded, the revenue would wash away any lingering legal sins. He severely underestimated the people he was abusing. Ivy Sloane, completely hollowed out by guilt and paralyzed by the sheer terror of taking the inevitable fall for this disaster, finally reached her breaking point. She could no longer play the role of the naive, loyal foot soldier. Late that Thursday evening, sitting alone in her darkened apartment, she opened her encrypted folder. She found the most recent, highly confidential internal messaging thread between Owen and the lead developer. In that specific digital exchange, the developer explicitly warned Owen that the bootlegged code was highly unstable and would likely generate entirely falsified operational data during the simulation. Owen's written reply was a direct order to ignore the data integrity and simply ensure the visual dashboard looked beautiful for the cameras. Ivy took a screenshot of that exact exchange. With shaking hands, she drafted a secure, untraceable email and attached the damning evidence. She bypassed her immediate supervisors entirely and sent the package directly to the private inboxes of Nora Feld and Marla Klein. She was no longer just preparing a defensive parachute. She was actively handing the executioners the exact weapon they needed to bring the chief executive down. The morning of the showcase arrived with a suffocating, heavy tension that seemed to settle over the entire convention space. The room was bathed in expensive, theatrical lighting, but the atmosphere was completely toxic. The heavy hitters began to arrive exactly on time. The most notable entrance was the senior risk assessment officer from the primary commercial bank that held the massive credit facility keeping Briargate financially afloat. The banker did not smile. He did not touch the complimentary breakfast. He took a seat in the second row, pulled out a leather-bound notebook, and sat with the rigid, terrifying stillness of an auditor who fully expected to find a corpse hidden in the financial ledgers. He was there to see if the chief executive's grand promises could actually support the weight of their largest corporate clients. 10 minutes later, Leah Whitmore walked through the double doors. The chief operating officer of Marston Home and Style arrived with an entourage of 3 senior compliance lawyers. Her attitude was entirely hostile. She did not engage in the usual pre-presentation networking. She ignored Owen completely when he attempted to offer a warm, welcoming handshake. Leah was not there to offer polite encouragement or to cheer for a long-term partner. She was there to serve as the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner. She was there to determine, once and for all, if Briargate deserved one final miraculous chance to handle her holiday volume, or if she was going to publicly sever the artery and let them bleed to death on the floor. 5 minutes before the presentation officially began, I walked into the auditorium. I did not sneak through a side door. I did not enter wearing the badge of a disgruntled former employee or a vengeful saboteur. Around my neck hung a crisp, laminated guest pass, formally issued and authorized by the legal counsel representing Marston Home and Style. Leah had explicitly requested my presence as an independent expert consultant to verify the technical integrity of whatever Briargate was about to project onto the screen. I did not walk to the front of the room. I did not try to catch Owen's eye or cause a scene. I quietly made my way to the very last row of the auditorium and took a seat in the shadows. I folded my hands perfectly still in my lap. I was the silent ghost of the foundation they had arrogantly tried to destroy. I had not come to scream, to gloat, or to throw the final punch. I had simply come to serve as a quiet witness to the exact moment when the crushing weight of reality finally shattered their magnificent, hollow illusion. The countdown had reached 0, and the lights were finally going down. The showcase opened with a blinding, high-definition display of perfectly synchronized graphics, projecting an aura of absolute technological dominance across the massive screens of the auditorium. Owen took the center stage, bathed in expensive spotlighting, wearing his custom-tailored suit and his signature, blindingly confident smile. He gripped the edges of the podium and launched into a meticulously rehearsed monologue about exponential market growth, relentless innovation, and the dawn of a dynamic new leadership team. However, anyone in the room with a sharp eye and a basic understanding of corporate body language immediately noticed the glaring omission. Ivy was nowhere to be found. The young photogenic intern, who had been so aggressively promoted to the role of project owner, was not standing proudly at Owen's side. She was completely absent from the executive lineup. To the seasoned veterans sitting in the audience, an invisible project lead on the day of a massive product launch was the equivalent of a loud, blaring fire alarm. Owen gracefully pivoted the presentation toward the live technical demonstration, yielding the floor to the lead engineering director. The massive screen switched from marketing slides to the actual operational interface of Project Holloway. For the first 4 minutes, the illusion held. The software successfully processed a few simple, standard return flows. A pristine item was scanned, a digital receipt was generated, and a basic refund was approved. Owen beamed at the audience, silently demanding their admiration. Then, the engineers transitioned the simulation to the complex return matrices. This was the exact operational territory I had spent years meticulously designing. It was the brutal, chaotic reality of partial refunds, damaged freight, and third-party vendor routing. The moment the bootlegged, outdated exception library attempted to process the heavy data load, the entire architecture violently buckled. Right in front of the investors, the banking representatives, and the most critical clients, the system began spontaneously generating duplicate classification codes. A single damaged sofa was suddenly registered in 3 different regional warehouses simultaneously. The automated refund forecasting module, crippled by the conflicting data, violently skewed the projected financial liabilities by hundreds of thousands of dollars within seconds. The executive dashboard flashed green, incorrectly signaling a successful transaction, while the raw warehouse data logs running on the adjacent screen screamed red, indicating a massive inventory collision. A sharp, authoritative voice cut through the hum of the failing servers. "Stop the presentation immediately." The demand did not come from a Briargate executive. It came from the senior compliance representative for Marston Home & Style, who was sitting directly next to Leah Whitmore. The representative stood up, pointing a rigid finger at the massive screens. "Power down that simulation right now," the Marston representative ordered, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous room. "That data is entirely corrupted. You are generating false financial liabilities and phantom inventory. Under no circumstances can a framework exhibiting this level of structural failure be utilized as the foundation for a secure production rollout. This system is fundamentally unsafe." The engineering director froze. Owen's confident smile instantly shattered, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. He reached for the microphone, stammering about a minor visual glitch in the display interface. Before Owen could spin another lie, Nora Feld stood up from her seat in the front row. The general counsel turned her back on her chief executive officer and faced the entire room. She looked directly at the board of directors, the banking partners, and the clients. "I must formally advise this assembly that the technical demonstration you are currently witnessing is operating outside of our legal compliance parameters," Nora declared, her voice ringing out with cold, surgical precision. "Briargate Commerce Systems does not possess a valid, countersigned continuity approval from our anchor client. Furthermore, we do not hold the full commercial usage rights to the core operational framework and the exception libraries that Owen is attempting to present to you today. The foundational intellectual property belongs exclusively to a third party." The entire auditorium plunged into a suffocating, dead silence. A general counsel breaking rank to publicly declare her own company in violation of intellectual property laws was the ultimate corporate execution. It was an unprecedented, fatal strike. Leah Whitmore did not hesitate. The chief operating officer of Marston stood up, her expression carved from solid ice. She looked directly at Owen, delivering the final, devastating blow without raising her voice a single decibel. "Based on the catastrophic technical failure we just witnessed, combined with the admission of severe legal non-compliance from your own counsel, Marston Home & Style is officially freezing all deployment activities with Briargate, effective immediately," Leah stated. "We are formally initiating emergency stabilization negotiations with Ramirez Flow Advisory to salvage our holiday rollout under a completely new, independent operational roadmap. We will be pursuing all available legal remedies regarding this breach of contract." The representative from the primary commercial bank slowly closed his leather-bound notebook and stood up. "In light of the anchor client freezing their contract and the severe legal and operational risks that have just been disclosed," the banker announced to the silent room, "our institution will be immediately reviewing Briargate's extended credit facility. We will place a temporary hold on all capital withdrawals until these liabilities are fully clarified and resolved to our satisfaction." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Owen stood frozen behind the podium, his hands gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked out at the sea of faces, realizing with absolute certainty that he was looking at his own professional funeral. Marla Klein did not wait for the room to clear. She did not pull Owen aside for a private conversation. That exact same night, she convened a closed-door, emergency session of the board of directors. Within exactly 1 hour, they held a unanimous vote. They immediately suspended Owen Mercer's executive authority, stripping him of his title, his access badges, and his corporate communication privileges. They simultaneously launched a massive internal investigation, citing his gross misrepresentation of the project's status, his willful disregard of documented legal warnings, and his reckless decision to push out the core talent holding the infrastructure together. Early the next morning, my secure email inbox chimed. It was an official, legally binding notice from the Briargate Board of Directors. The document formally, explicitly acknowledged that I was the sole original architect and designer of Project Holloway. Enclosed with the acknowledgement was a fully executed copy of my emergency consulting agreement, accepting every single one of my non-negotiable financial terms, including the massive upfront licensing fee. I agreed to accept the short-term transition package. I did not do it to return as a loyal employee. I did not do it to salvage Owen's ruined reputation or to save the board of directors from their own lack of oversight. I signed the contract to ensure that the clients I had spent 12 years protecting were not dragged down into the abyss by the sheer, blinding arrogance of a failed executive team. In the aftermath, the landscape shifted permanently. Briargate Commerce Systems was forced to severely scale back its ambitious market projections. To balance their bleeding cash reserves and appease their furious lenders, the board was forced to sell off an entire secondary operational division at a massive loss. The company became a fraction of what it used to be. Meanwhile, my independent firm rapidly expanded. I took on a roster of elite enterprise clients who had stood in that auditorium and witnessed firsthand exactly who was truly keeping the massive gears turning. My ultimate retaliation was never about burning the company to the ground with my own 2 hands. True power does not require screaming or sabotage. My greatest revenge was simply stepping out of the shadows, taking the absolute truth with me, and allowing the hollow, rotten structure they had so arrogantly built to collapse entirely under the harsh light of day. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can reach even more people.